good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see so many people joining us. Some familiar faces and some familiar names and other ones that we don't know, but who are equally welcome to this event. My name is Anne Rigney, and I'd like to welcome you today to this online meeting on behalf of the Utrecht Forum for Memory Studies. Our meeting today is the result of a collaboration between the Forum and the ERC-funded projects Remembering Activism and Memory Rights, based here in Utrecht, and the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. And we're very grateful to all parties, and especially to Daniela Salerno, the lead researcher on memory rights, who's gone to great lengths to bring us all together here today. So we're very grateful to Daniela, whom is here next to me, who's now also taken on the additional responsibility of being the technical support on this meeting. So thank you very much, Daniela, for that. So he's going to be active behind the scenes, and later on he will be monitoring your questions. Before I go any further, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the lecture itself will be recorded. We won't be recording the Q&A. So if you don't want to appear in the recording, please turn off your camera. The idea is to put your questions in the chat, and depending on many questions there are, we'll either ask you to submit them again in person, or we will just respond to them from the chat. Daniela will be feeding them to me, and I will be feeding them to Michelle, and that way we hope to have a very lively discussion. We'll go on only to 6:30 at the latest, so we'll stop anywhere between 6:15 and 6:30, depending on how many questions we have, and of course the stamina of our speaker. Without further ado, so I'd like to introduce our speaker, and that's Professor Michelle Caswell, who's coming to us from the University of California, Los Angeles, where of course it's still morning. So we're all the more grateful to you, Michelle, that you were willing to get up early to be with us in what for us is the late afternoon. So it's dark outside here. We'd of course hoped to have you here in person, but COVID regulations put paid to that, I'm afraid. But at least this way we have the advantage of being able to speak to you in the company of so many colleagues and so many interested parties from across Europe and the world. So there are, I think, upsides to COVID. So let me just, for the benefit of those who don't know you, let me just say a few words of introduction to Michelle Caswell's work. Michelle Caswell is an associate professor of archival studies in the Department of Information Studies at UCLA. And she is really one of the go-to persons in the field of critical archive studies, as well as a leading thinker and a leading practitioner in the field of community archiving. She's director of the UCLA's Community Archives Lab, and she was one of the co-founders of the South Asian American Digital Archive. I think I pronounced it right as SAADA. And she's author of the prize-winning book, Archiving the Unspeakable, Silence, Memory, and the Photographic Record in Cambodia, which was published by the University of Wisconsin Press as part of their Critical Human Rights series in 2014. She's also co-edited several important collections in the field of critical archive studies, including a special issue of Archival Science on Towards a Decolonial Archive, a special issue of Journal of Critical Library and Information Studies on critical archive studies, and another special issue of Archival Science on archives and human rights. Her most recent book, Urgent Archives, Enacting Liberatory Memory Work, was published very recently by Routledge in 2021. And it's on this subject that she'll be speaking to us today, but I leave her to introduce that topic herself when I give her the floor, or the screen, whatever you call it. Just to say one more thing, I realized as I was preparing this introduction that this is actually the first time in our, by now quite a long history, that we've had a talk on archives at our Memory Studies Forum. But reading Michel Caswell's work in the last 10 months has shown me that this is really long, long overdue. Without archives, without some traces of the past being recorded and cherished, there is no memory. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn over the screen to our guest, and so please join me in welcoming Michel Caswell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for that really beautiful introduction. I'm going to share my screen because I have slides. So here we go. Great. Thank you. I am delighted to be here today, and I really wish that I could be there with you in person. I join you today from the University of California, Los Angeles, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. So the title of my talk today is Urgent Archives, Enacting Liberatory Memory Work. The talk is based on my book of the same title, as Anne just said, which came out in May from Routledge Press. Specifically, today's presentation is from chapter 3, which is called From Representation to Liberation. So my previous work has addressed the ways in which marginalized identity-based community archives, which I'll talk more about that term in a second, the way in which those community archives counter the symbolic annihilation of oppressed communities. That is the ways that predominantly white university and government archives have underrepresented, misrepresented, or completely ignored communities of color and LGBTQ+ communities. I've posited that community archives counter symbolic annihilation with what I call representational belonging, empowering people who have been marginalized or minoritized by mainstream media outlets and memory institutions to have the autonomy and authority to establish, enact, and reflect on their presence in ways that are complex, meaningful, substantive, and positive in a variety of symbolic contexts, including archives. So this presentation will build on and go beyond these previous findings, using recent projects by the South Asian American Digital Archive, which I'll refer to by its acronym SAADA, as examples. So more specifically, I'll address the relationship between liberatory appraisal. Appraisal is the process by which archivists decide what to keep and what to get rid of. The relationship between liberatory appraisal and liberatory outreach in community archives, arguing that community archives can build on recuperative and representational collecting initiatives to do more than that, to activate records to stop cycles of oppression. I'll introduce a new concept, corollary records, and show how records from similar moments in history can be activated in the present. I will also argue that more robust and accurate representation of minoritized communities is a limiting end goal for community archives, however important, and it is important. I argue that community archives must aim for more than representation. We must do more than collecting materials documenting activism. We must also leverage the histories we have painstakingly recuperated for liberatory ends. Through strategic outreach with activists, artists, and other community members, archivists can ensure the records in their care are activated to stop oppression in the present. So ultimately, I will argue that community archives can pair liberatory appraisal with liberatory activation in order to resist the white temporal imaginary, which is a phrase from Charles Mills, who passed away just a few weeks ago. But first, I should clarify what I mean when I say community archives. So diverging from archival thinking about government and bureaucratic records, which was the norm for centuries of archival studies literature, the past decade has seen the rapid expansion of inquiries into what we now call community archives or community-based archives. The first attempts to describe the community archives phenomenon emerged from the UK. So writing in 2009, Andrew Flynn, Mary Stevens, and Elizabeth Shepherd wrote, quote, "A community is any group of people who come together and present themselves as such, and a community archive is the product of their attempts to document the history of their commonality." The same research team continued, quote, "The defining characteristic of community archives is the active participation of a community in documenting and making accessible the history of their particular group and or locality on their own terms." And on their own terms is bold and italicized because it's really this nature of autonomy that is important, I think, that distinguishes community archives from other kinds of archives. So this definition is great. It really got me started. I owe a lot to it, right? I don't think I would have been able to do work about community archives without having this foundation to build on. But I do think that this definition requires some refinement in our current context, particularly in my current context, which is the United States. So I think that we can't discuss the phenomenon of community archives in the US, where I am, without addressing power inequities. So here we can broadly divide community archives into two categories. So first, those that represent and serve dominant communities, such as some, not all, but some historical societies that are often invested in white supremacist histories as a way to maintain or increase local property values. And secondly, those that represent and serve underrepresented, marginalized, minoritized, or oppressed communities. And it's this latter group of community archives that my research addresses. So we might call them more specifically minoritized identity-based community archives, in which the history held in common coalesces around a shared history of oppression, be that oppression based on white supremacy, hetero-patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, ableism, and their complex intersections. Furthermore, I think it's important to distinguish independent community archives from what we now might call community-driven or community accountable collecting projects located within dominant institutions. So to be absolutely clear, when I say community archives, I'm using it as a kind of shorthand to say independent, minoritized, identity-based community archives, which I know is clunky and there's not really like a nice acronym associated with that. And then another point of clarification before I get started, although my talk draws on my experiences as the co-founder and an ongoing volunteer for SAADA, I've not directly worked on the three main projects I will discuss with you shortly, other than digitizing some of the collections from which the projects draw and providing some general feedback. So I'm in constant conversation with SAADA's executive director, Samit Malik, who's the other co-founder, and I often provide informal advice on project ideas and implementation, but really these are his projects. So I cannot claim to stand entirely apart from the work addressed in the talk, but I also make no assertions of them being my projects. I also make no assertions of being an outside researcher, though I'm a white outsider for sure to the South Asian American community, since I'm an integral component of the phenomenon my work describes in a manner consistent with participant observation as a research method. I also cannot claim ownership or take credit for most of the archival labor I'm about to describe, and I shift back and forth between saying we or they in discussing the work of SAADA when appropriate. So I'll get started where I usually do, which is SAADA. So speaking at a July 2020 community-wide open Zoom meeting, SAADA Executive Director Samit Malik said, quote, "As an organization, even though we are thinking about and engaging with the past, our work has really always been about the present, the now," end quote. The meeting was called by Malik in the midst of three intertwined crises: a global pandemic that has disproportionately devastated Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities in the US context, the ongoing state-sanctioned murder of Black Americans brought to the fore by the murder of George Floyd, and at that point in time, the inept, malfeasant, white supremacist national leadership in the US White House. Quote, "We have some good news to share in the midst of this challenging time," Samit's invitation promised. We all needed that good news, for sure. So the July 2020 meeting was an opportunity to celebrate the organization's 12th birthday, to announce a new grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that would help support the organization, and to launch a fundraising campaign with supporters. But it was also an opportunity to demonstrate the archive's value by drawing on what I call corollary moments from the community's past to make sense of the seemingly senseless and increasingly overwhelming present. At that moment, that meant activating records in SAADA's collections to inspire action around three major events: the COVID-19 epidemic, the movement for Black lives, and the, at that point, then upcoming 2020 US presidential election. So there is little doubt we are living through a historic moment, reads the opening text of SAADA's participatory initiative to document South Asian American experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Launched in April 2020, the project, Letters from 6 Feet Away, asks South Asian Americans to write a letter to their future selves about their experiences with the pandemic. With the creator's permission, the letters are included in the archives and mailed to the creator in the future, quote, "in hopefully better days ahead." Participants respond to a series of prompts online, upload a photograph of themselves, designate degrees of privacy or publicity from a continuum of options provided, and submit a mailing address in which they would like their letters to be sent back to themselves in the future. There's also a space to honor a loved one who's passed during the crisis. The submissions are deeply personal and self-reflective, yet collectively offer a window into a wider community ethos of grief, feelings of isolation, and search for solace. In these letters, historic traumas surface and resurface as South Asian Americans learn to cope with the new reality. And I'll read you just one excerpt from one letter to give you an example. In her public entry to the project, Samara Ghosh of Texas writes, quote, "I would remember the first news that we needed to store food. My first instinct was to buy rice and salt at Gandhi Bazaar. It was a reaction to historic trauma that my community went through. Bengal had a big man-made famine post-World War II, and rice and salt were in scarcity. I had heard stories of what my family went through. I was surprised that this deep-seated insecurity had surfaced," end quote. So in this case, the Bengal famine of 1943 emerges as a powerful intergenerational memory, being relived even though the writer herself had never directly experienced it. She continued that getting groceries delivered in the early days of the quarantine, quote, "felt like Christmas morning." So for some participants, the pandemic surfaced deeply ingrained traumas and enacted circular temporalities, as if history was repeating itself, oceans and decades away in a vastly different context. The letters are created to be read at a non-corollary moment in the future, in the hopes that in the future, when the pandemic has presumably subsided, or at least its demands on us are presumably different, that activating these records by reading them will reveal some new insight into what will then be that present moment. This project builds community by providing a platform for letters to be shared with each other. But more importantly, it underscores the emotional importance of the creation of records to participants. Those who write letters to themselves, I think, feel validated, heard, documented in the historic record, even if they choose not to share their letters with others. And that's sort of my next project, is interviewing those who participate in these kinds of participatory projects to see what it feels like to have your story documented. So in the future, the project transforms records creators into records users as participants read their own letters from the not so distant past. And in doing so, it inaugurates a cyclical temporality, catalyzing movement back and forth along a pendulum swinging between now, a year and a half ago, and a year and a half from now. So after inviting attendees of the July 2020 community meeting to participate in the Letters from 6 Feet Away project, Sameep then pivoted to the other crisis on everyone's minds, the proliferation of and impunity for state-sponsored violence against Black people in the US. South Asian Americans have a complicated history with the American racial hierarchy, as many records in SAADA attest. Some early immigrants from India align themselves with whiteness to varying degrees of success, while others passed as Black. The 1965 US Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act that enabled South Asians to immigrate to the US in larger numbers would not have been possible without the civil rights movement. Yet anti-Black racism remains an ongoing problem within the community, despite the efforts of many South Asian American activists. For Sameep, the July 2020 meeting was an opportunity to further position SAADA as an organization committed to justice for Black people. Acknowledging the complexity of these histories, he drew connections between the ongoing movement for Black lives and corollary moments in history in which South Asian Americans were involved in activism for Black liberation. Yet he also directly confronted anti-Black racism within the community and did not gloss over its history of sometimes aspirational misalignment with white supremacy or whiteness. Quote, "In response to the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and too many others, we are sharing stories from our community's past that help engage our community today in the struggle against anti-Black racism," he said. He then recounted the story of H.G. Mudgall, an Indian immigrant to Harlem in the 1920s, who became the editor of Marcus Garvey's newspaper and an outspoken activist for Black independence. Quote, "H.G. Mudgall's story is a reminder both of the historical possibilities and duties for South Asians to engage in solidarity with Black communities, but moreover, the urgency now for us to engage in those solidarities and to address anti-Blackness within our own communities, Sameep said. He continued, quote, to be able to share these stories from the past, to be able to engage with contemporary discourse and dialogue and movements has been really rewarding and enriching for us as an organization, and I hope they help to move our community as well, end quote. So Malik's comments here reflect a temporality of urgency in which records from the past are invoked to inspire contemporary political action. In this way, the 1920s are set up as a corollary moment to the 2020s, and records documenting H.G. Mudgall from the 1920s are set up as corollary records to those being created by South Asian American activists fighting anti-Black racism now. By catalyzing corollary records from corollary moments, Malik showed precedent for South Asian American solidarity with Black Americans, evoking historical possibilities, as he put it, that align the community with the contemporary movement for Black lives. These activations forge a cyclical temporality that dispenses with the US racial progress narrative of white time. Instead of insisting that it gets better for minoritized communities, these efforts show how oppressive histories can repeat, how historical possibilities can be invoked to forge affinities and solidarities in the present, how a precedent of anti-racist activism can inspire action for Black lives in the now. In this work, archives become urgently relevant and critically contemporary. The current moment demands more than archives simply documenting these stories of solidarity in hopes some future users might find them. Instead, SAADA catalyzes these records into action to forge corollary moments across cycles of time and to create a temporality of urgency for the communities it serves and represents. So Malik's final announcement at the July 2020 meeting also conveyed the urgency of the past by forging yet another corollary moment with the present. Looking ahead, what at that point was ahead, to the November 2020 US presidential election, Sameep discussed a video that SAADA had produced in May 2020 featuring Roni Bagai, whose grandparents, Vaishno Das and Kala Bagai, were among the first immigrants from India to the US arriving in 1915. And this is a collection that I worked on, that I digitized, and it's really exciting, I think, to see it activated in this way. But I want to play for you this video now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then reshare it with the video. It's a 2.5-minute video.
Why does your vote matter? Well, allow me to tell you a story. This is my family. My grandparents came here in search of a better life for themselves and their 3 sons, including my dad. They arrived in San Francisco just over 100 years ago in 1915, but it was a time of xenophobia and racism, particularly against those from South Asia, like my family. Shortly after my grandparents arrived, Congress passed a new law banning South Asians from coming to the US. But my grandparents were lucky. They were here together. They bought a home and started a business. In 1921, my grandfather even achieved his dream and became an American citizen. But just 2 years later, his dream was shattered. In 1923, the Supreme Court made it illegal for South Asians to be American citizens. My grandfather's citizenship was nullified, and he was left without a country to call his own. This destroyed him, and sadly, a few years later, he took his own life. In a letter he left behind, he wrote, "I came to America thinking, dreaming, and hoping to make this land my home. I established myself and tried to give my children the best American education. But they now say, I am no longer an American citizen. Now, what am I? What have I made of myself and my children? We cannot exercise our rights. Is life worth living in a gilded cage?" It was more than 20 years later before the laws were changed, and South Asians, including my dad and my grandmother, could finally apply for American citizenship. This is why voting matters. I hope my family's story is a reminder of what we've endured to get the rights we have now, how easily they can be taken away, and how hard it is to win them back. If you haven't yet, please register to vote right now. And please, please vote in November.
So hold on a second, let me reshare my screen with my slides, but let me first remember to turn that video off.
So this is teeny, teeny, tiny little needles.
Oh,
Otherwise, you will all get an ad. 1 second. There we go. There we go. So in that brief video, Roni Bagai articulated a cyclical temporality, later echoed by Samip at the community meeting, that refuses the logic of white racial progress narratives. Progress is not a given. The granting of an ever-increasing number of rights is not inevitable. Rather, these messages communicate South Asian Americans did not always have these rights. Their ancestors fought for them. They could be rescinded. We might have to fight for them again. Oppressive histories repeat themselves. The threat of this repetition looms large. So in just 2.5 minutes, I think this video counters white temporalities that assume the inevitability and desirability of a just post-racial future. Instead, we see a community weathering repeated attacks throughout history and using traces of the past to ward off the next attack in the present, drawing on records from corollary moments, in this case, the 1923 dismantling of citizenship rights to catalyze voter registration in 2020. There's a temporal urgency to the past here and to archival activations of the past. So in each of these cases, SAADA is drawing on what I call corollary records from corollary moments to catalyze political consciousness and action in the now. Corollary records document reoccurring moments in time in which the same or similar oppressions get repeated. A corollary moment is a point in time with historical precedence. At their most useful, records can be activated in corollary moments in the present so that community members can learn activist tactics and strategies and get inspiration to keep going. We've been here before, we've survived this before, we've resisted before, corollary records assert. Here's how. By activating corollary records, SAADA's community members are, if only for a second, interrupting reoccurring oppressions by learning from previous generations of community members facing similar corollary moments. This is one way archives can dismantle systemic oppression and engage in liberatory memory work, by catalyzing the activation of corollary records in the past to inspire and strategize activism in the present. These 3 examples mark an important shift for the organization, a movement from collecting records for recuperative and representational purposes, what I would call a form of liberatory appraisal, towards using and encouraging others to use those records against oppression in what I call liberatory activation. In the initial years of working with SAADA, Samip, other volunteers, and I were stunned with the amount of materials we found that dated back before 1965, when US immigration law changed to enable greater numbers of South Asians into the US. Back in 2008, when we founded SAADA, we had read about California's early Punjabi Mexican communities and heard rumors about a few anti-colonial activists along the West Coast of the US and Canada from the turn of the 20th century. But honestly, we had no idea the wealth of records we'd find once we really started to look. We feverishly collected as many pre-1965 records as we could find, thrilled to fill in some of the gaps and silences we had found when we looked for South Asian American stories in mainstream repositories like the US National Archives and dozens of university archives. So our initial aims were recuperative, in the sense that we were trying to recuperate lost histories, pulling them back from oblivion into the community's consciousness. Our work was also representational, in the sense that we were trying to increase the amount and types of representations of South Asians in the US stories about the past. Recuperative and representational collecting kept us busy for nearly a decade, and guided by a very broad appraisal policy, we discovered and digitized more than we had ever anticipated about South Asian American history. So building on Wendy Duff and Vern Harris's naming of liberatory description, I characterize these initial recuperative and representational collecting impulses as a form of liberatory appraisal. So appraisal is the process by which archivists assign evidentiary value to collections of materials, resulting in important decisions about what is archival, what falls within organizational scope, what gets collected, and conversely, what gets excluded, and ultimately, what might get destroyed. So appraisal theory has preoccupied archival studies for a century. It's really the bulk of archival theory is in appraisal, resulting in a host of theories, strategies, and tactics archivists employ to make appraisal decisions, including assigning notions of primary and secondary value, a functional analysis, documentation strategy, a host of ideas that we can spend a whole semester talking about, which indeed I do in archival appraisal classes. Recently, I proposed feminist standpoint appraisal as a type of liberatory appraisal that acknowledges the positionality of the appraiser and seeks to center the needs of those most disempowered due to the interlocking oppressions of white supremacy and hetero-patriarchy. In placing value in materials created by minoritized communities, in appraising them as worthy of retention and preservation, and in thinking about the affective, material, and political consequences of such decisions on the communities represented in such records, archivists engage in representational and recuperative collecting can be said to engage in a form of liberatory appraisal. Still, for SAADA staff and community members, representing Brown people in US history has never been enough. For years, SAMEEP and community members have discussed how, if the archives only collected the records of the most prominent South Asian Americans, the collection would replicate the same forms of erasure it sought to combat. So what good would a South Asian American digital archives be if it only validated the experiences of straight, cis, upper caste, wealthy men? Keenly aware of these archival silences, SAMEEP consciously sought out collections created by South Asian American people and organizations further minoritized by gender, caste, sexuality, region, religion, ability, and class. So over the years, it became increasingly clear that for SAADA's collection to be inclusive of these groups most minoritized within South Asian American communities, we would have to think outside of the box of dominant Western archival appraisal, and instead catalyze the creation of new records rather than just searching for pre-existing records to digitize. So in 2019, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, SAADA launched a program called the Archival Creators Fellowship Program, which partnered with 3 different cohorts, we're in our 3rd cohort now, of fellows to create archival collections that reflect the histories and perspectives of some of the most marginalized groups within the South Asian American community. So people like Dalit women, Indo-Guyanese immigrants, and queer and trans people. Most of these new collections have a significant oral history and storytelling component that depart from dominant archival practices. For example, they allow for participants to remain anonymous if they choose, given the real threat of violence that Dalit, trans, queer, gender nonconforming, and other community members face. So the project reveals how, in the absence of robust pre-existing documentation, recuperation alone is not enough, right? While it's crucial to catalyze the generation of new records that fill in these gaps, right? In order to truly center minoritized communities, archives must also learn when and how to respect silences, to resist surveillance, and honor consent as an ongoing process rather than a single transaction. And this means changing commonly accepted practices and policies for archives. So our twin impulses of recuperation and representation were motivated by what I would come to describe as countering the symbolic annihilation of South Asian Americans with representational belonging. So by finding, digitizing, and providing access to as many records documenting the early histories of South Asian Americans as we could, we were countering the community's symbolic annihilation in history with a powerful assertion of existence and belonging. So clearly, experiences of seeing yourself and your community in history after being excluded or misrepresented due to racism or hetero-patriarchy are emotionally powerful. Nearly every interview and focus group I've conducted with the volunteers, staff, users, and donors to minoritized community-based archives over the past 5 years confirm the emotional impact of robust representation after repeated and extended experiences of symbolic annihilation in mainstream archives. This affective impact, archives provoking the feeling of self-recognition, can be an important emotional element of liberation. It is joyous to see yourself robustly represented after being symbolically annihilated. And this joy is inherently political in a system that's designed to oppress. But it's also important to note that symbolic and actual annihilation are intimately related. Symbolic annihilation both precedes and succeeds actual annihilation, such that individuals and communities are rendered expendable, invisible, or non-existent before they are subject to violence, particularly state-sanctioned violence. And then after violence, such murderous acts are often rendered invisible or expunged from the record, magnifying and mimicking the violence itself. So every dehumanizing misrepresentation in archives that says you're not quite human, every archival absence that says you're not important enough to collect, adds up to create the conditions that enable mass murder or genocide or violence to occur. And then after acts of violence, every dehumanizing misrepresentation of that violence in archives that says you deserved it anyway, and every archival absence of that violence that says your death is not even important enough to note, also adds up to the conditions that justify mass murder, genocide, acts of violence, and grant impunity for it and enable it to occur again. So given this link between symbolic and actual annihilation, any discussion of liberatory archives must assert the importance of robust representation and recuperative collecting. Liberatory appraisal strategies such as these seek to center oppressed positionalities by assigning archival value based on the needs of oppressed communities. These needs may include valuing records for evidentiary purposes in the case of potential legal redress, or for affective purposes in the case of countering symbolic annihilation with representation of belonging. So it matters if you can see yourself represented in history. It matters if others can see you represented in history. But still, representation is not the only or ultimate goal of liberatory memory work. So let me give you another concrete example of what I mean here. So in 2019, two amazing Berkeley activists, Barnali Ghosh and Anirvan Chatterjee, who are also supporters of SAADA, successfully campaigned to get a street in downtown Berkeley, California, named after Kala Bagai, Roni Bagai's grandmother, who you just saw in the video that I shared. It's an amazing and joyous act to watch South Asian Americans recognize themselves in this official street sign, as I saw this past summer. So Kala Bagai Way is now the final stop on the Berkeley Radical South Asian History Walking Tour, which is organized by Barnali Ghosh and Anirvan Chatterjee. It's absolutely important, I think, to rename our streets in honor of BIPOC women, 100%. And I think this is maybe, if not the only, maybe one of two streets in the US named after a South Asian American woman. But let's not stop there. Right? As the activists who got the street renamed would agree, let's also activate records to abolish policing as we know it on that corner, to end white supremacy and hetero-patriarchy on that corner, to advocate for giving the land back to indigenous communities, right? Which was really quite amazing that the local indigenous community whose land this is wrote a letter of support to the Berkeley City Council in support of renaming the street Kala Bagai Way, which was incredible. Let's make Kala Bagai Way a liberated zone, not just in name, but in action, right? So too often recuperative collecting projects fall into a trap of respectability that is ultimately counter to the aims of liberation. So a politics of respectability insists on collecting records that conform to dominant expectations about what a minoritized community should be. And this is true of many university-led projects that seek to recuperate the history of minoritized communities by documenting their prominent firsts. So the first politician, the first business leader, the first actor from a given community. Filling archives with celebratory success stories from prominent leaders can reinforce harmful stereotypes that blame oppressed people for their own oppression. So many Asian American community archives, for example, can undergird model minority myths that thinly veil anti-Black racism. Such collections, whether they are in dominant or community-led archives, are about inclusion within oppressive structures rather than liberation from them. And I think they pander to dominant groups instead of resisting domination. Furthermore, as many trans activists have noted, the heightened visibility brought about by increased representation can further expose vulnerable communities to violence and other forms of oppression. So this paradox, simultaneously holding in tension representation and endangerment, visibility and invisibility, presence and absence, speaks directly to cyclical temporalities as minoritized communities respond to repeating cycles of oppression and then flashes of liberation. The desire or need to be seen and heard changes over time in response to the larger political climate. Visibility, one might ask, for whom? And again, this question, for whom, is central to community archives. In this context, recuperative and representational collecting can be exploitative, extractive, and harmful, the result of oppressive appraisal practices if downstream use is not considered. So given this complexity, more representational collecting is not necessarily the result of liberatory appraisal, but it can be. Recuperative and representational collecting can be liberatory appraisal strategies if they're part of a larger liberatory project. Thus, liberatory appraisal, in my estimation, is the process of determining the value of records in regard to their potential activation for liberation struggles. Contrary to the past century of dominant Western appraisal theory, liberatory appraisal considers the potential uses of records in making appraisal decisions and further asks whose uses and for what aims. In this sense, liberatory appraisal is intimately tied to liberatory outreach, as it is only in the activation of records that their full liberatory potential can be realized. Its undergirding assumption is that archives can catalyze particular kinds of use, political, artistic, activist, by modeling that use in their own practices and by targeting outreach efforts to groups engaged in liberatory work. And I think the examples from SAADA really show you that. So I'm looking at the time, I'm going to start to wrap up. My argument here echoes and complicates an argument made by Jarrett Drake in a 2018 blog post in which he questioned any easy notion of community. He wrote, quote, "Archivists must shift their paradigms away from the fictive notions of local and community-based towards a more radically precise and politically liberatory language," right? So Drake identifies the ways that community can be invoked as a euphemism to talk about minoritized people without a power analysis. That is, without addressing the oppressive systems that minoritize them in the first place. And I think Drake rightfully pushes the field beyond recuperation and representation into more incisive, specific liberatory aims, right? Community archives, it has become increasingly clear to me, must leverage the recuperative and representational imperatives to activate corollary records across corollary moments in the present for liberation from oppressive systems. The work of archives and the work of activism, the work of representation and the work of liberation cannot occur on separate but parallel tracks. They must be intertwined. And I will stop there and open the floor up for questions. I don't know if any yet have been put in the chat.